Americans are taught their nation fought World War II to free Europe from Nazi tyranny, but historical accounts prove otherwise. President Franklin Roosevelt continued President Woodrow Wilson's effort to unite all nations under a world government based in New York. Creating a United Nations under American control required destroying the growing German and Japanese empires, dismantling the huge British and French empires, and weakening the growing Soviet Union. Roosevelt was thrilled when war began between the Germans and Soviets in 1941. However, the rapid German advance concerned him. Fearing the Soviet Union might lose, he began a massive American aid program to ship tons of war material to the Soviets. This was controversial, since the Soviets were promoting worldwide communism and had invaded several countries. Historian David McCullough wrote that Senator Harry Truman justified this aid to the press on June 22, 1941, quote, "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances." During 1941, Roosevelt took steps to form what he called the United Nations. The first step was the Inter-Allied Conference that led to the Declaration of St. James Palace on June 12, 1941. By August, Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had drafted the Atlantic Charter to define goals for the post-war world. At subsequent meetings of the Inter-Allied Council in London on September 24, 1941, the 8 governments in exile of countries under Axis occupation, together with the Soviet Union and representatives of the Free French forces, unanimously adopted the common principles of a United Nations. Note that this occurred before the United States entered World War II. Soon after the United States formally entered the war on December 8, 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met at the White House for the Arcadia Conference to update the war strategy. Roosevelt promoted the idea of a United Nations and insisted this term be used when referring to the Allies. This is a poster created in 1942 by the U.S. Office of War Information, showing the 26 members of the alliance. Newsreels from the war often refer to Allied units as United Nations forces, like this one from 1942.
Landing in force, they take the vital North African airdrome at Sukalarba, just 5 minutes before German planes bent upon the same mission were driven off. Another field from which United Nations air forces are conducting their combined offensive to drive the Axis from the shores of Africa.
Churchill knew that Roosevelt wanted to dismantle the British Empire, but he needed American aid and hoped to thwart his plan. See the short video below, Everyone Lost World War II, that details Roosevelt's effort to bankrupt the British. The Germans had mostly destroyed the French Empire with its 1940 invasion, but left its overseas empire intact along with the powerful French Navy. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to destroy the French Navy and invade its colonies before fighting the Germans. See the short video link below, The Anglo-American War on France. The biggest operation in the war on France was the invasion of neutral French North Africa in late 1942 that was planned months before the United States entered World War II. This became Operation Torch, which was opposed by senior generals. They wanted to focus resources to invade France in 1943. However, Roosevelt had no interest in fighting the Germans to win the war quickly. He wanted Germany and the Soviets to destroy each other, while he expanded his United Nations to rule the world. This scheme to avoid fighting the Germans and France meant the Allies suffered over 100,000 casualties during pointless fighting in Africa when they could have invaded Italy directly. Tales of the American Empire produce The Madness of Operation Torch, about this topic, with a follow-on video, An Invasion of Sicily in 1942. Both are linked below. Invading Sicily in late 1942 had risks, yet the option of invading the Italian island of Sardinia had none. It is relatively flat, with many beaches, so difficult to defend. There were no German aircraft or troops on Sardinia in late 1942, and few Italian. It was beyond the range of most Axis aircraft flying from mainland Italy. Sardinia was defended by just 3 local coastal security divisions and 2 second-rate regular infantry divisions. The only serious fighting unit was the understrength Italian 32nd Tank Infantry Regiment, with just 3 dozen old medium tanks supported by armored cars. This is why most Allied planners recommended the seizure of Sardinia in 1943 rather than Sicily. This would have allowed Allied bombers to reach southern France and all of Italy, and might be sufficient to drive Italy out of the war. If not, air support from this island could cover an amphibious landing in southern France. If the Allies had invaded Sardinia in November 1942, rather than North Africa, Italy may have switched sides sooner. By the summer of 1943, Allied forces could have amassed the logistics and air power on Sardinia to invade undefended southern France and easily capture 2 excellent seaports. This was an obvious step to support a major invasion of France in 1943 that was advocated by several generals, but was not done until August 1944 with Operation Dragoon, because resources were wasted in a war to seize French colonies and a bloody invasion of Italy from the south. German units were positioned to defend southern France in 1944 because the Allied invasion of French North Africa in 1942 justified the dissolution of the neutral Vichy government and its small army. Secret negotiations with the French government in 1942 to ensure its safety could have allowed Allied forces to disembark at French ports as the 100,000-man French armistice army joined the Allies. Much of the fighting after the June 1944 invasion of France at Normandy involved efforts to capture strategic seaports that the Germans had fortified. The Allies could have landed at ports in southern France a month before the landing in the north, thus forcing the Germans to send their reserve forces in France to the south. This could have supported American General George Marshall's desire to invade France in 1943 from Britain. This was Operation Roundup, that was approved by American and British generals in 1942, but later rejected by Roosevelt and Churchill, who had no desire to win the war quickly. They were focused on capturing the remaining French Empire and growing the newly established United Nations. This world government would be headquartered in the Empire State of New York, near Wall Street, where wealthy Roosevelt had worked for several years. Roosevelt's scheme to form a United Nations was successful, but it did not become a tool to rule the world. The Soviet army pushed into Eastern Europe and Germany before the tardy Allies broke out of the Normandy beachhead in August 1944. See the short video below, Poland Lost World War II. Roosevelt did weaken the British Empire that collapsed a few years after the war ended. The French Empire attempted to rise from ashes, but it mostly failed. The German and Japanese empires were destroyed. Roosevelt assumed that his billionaire friend, Chiang Kai-shek, would become a powerful ally to intimidate the Soviets, but he was defeated by the Chinese Communists in 1949. China became an ally of the Soviets and a threat to American interests. The Allies ended up rebuilding Germany and Japan to oppose communism. Roosevelt had assumed the United Nations Security Council would rule the world, but the Soviets and later China had veto power. The United Nations still exists today, but became a club for diplomats and not the seat of a world government. Had the Allies landed in Germany in 1943, they would probably have reached Berlin before the Soviets. The war could have ended in 1943 with far less bloodshed if the Allies had sought conditional surrenders from Germany and Japan to ensure Eastern Europe, China, and Korea remained free from communist rule. Franklin Roosevelt was not an evil president, although over 200,000 Americans were killed or wounded in senseless invasions of Africa and southern Italy. This is the American cemetery in Tunisia, where victims of his effort are buried. Roosevelt believed a world government based in New York could ensure world peace, but he did not share this objective with the American people and the U.S. Congress. The fact that Roosevelt's goal in World War II was to unite nations under one government may shock some Americans. Those with doubts can visit the FDR Library to watch video like this.
The most important legacy Franklin Roosevelt left the world was the United Nations organization. From the earliest days of World War II, FDR worked to create a post-war organization dedicated to global cooperation and peace through collective security. On January 1, 1942, he welcomed representatives of 25 Allied nations to the White House to sign a declaration pledging each to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice.